Welcome to this YSL Report Builder 2016 tutorial. In this video we'll explain how you can create table groups with detail rows. We'll show you two main techniques you can use to achieve this, starting with a details first approach and then followed by the group first approach. We'll explain how you can add and control group headers and footers, along with adding aggregates to a group, and then we'll finish the video by explaining how you can apply sorting to both the detail rows and the groups in the same table. So let's get started. To get started, I've created a new report, and the first thing I'll add to it is a data source which connects to the YSL Movies database. If you don't already have a copy of that, you can find out exactly how to install it using this extra video we have in a separate series, and you'll find a link in that video's description which will give you access to a script which will help you to install the database. Assuming you've done that already, let's right-click our data sources folder and choose to add a new data source. If you have a shared data source from a previous video in the series, feel free to use that one. Otherwise, create a new data source called Movies, choose to use a connection embedded in the report, click the build button to avoid having to write out your entire connection string, enter the name of the instance of your SQL server, mine's SQL 2016 training, and then you can select the Movies database from the drop-down list that appears. If I click OK a couple of times, that's the data source created. Now let's add a data set using the data source we've created. I can right-click on it and choose to add a data set which uses it. Let's call the data set Films and Directors. That gives you a bit of a clue as to what data set we're going to create. I'll use the query designer to build this one. I'd like to create a table in the report which shows a list of directors followed by the films that they've made. So let's head to the director table first and select a couple of fields from there. We'll choose the director ID which we'll use to apply the groups. We'll get slightly better performance using the ID field rather than the full text name field. But let's include the full name field which we can display to the user to make the report readable. From the film table then we can choose any fields we'd like to include in the details. So let's include the film title, maybe the release date, the runtime minutes, and let's go for the Oscar wins as well. Having done that, we can click OK a couple of times, and that's our data set created. Now there are two main approaches you can take to building a table which includes groups and detail items. The first technique we'll cover involves building a table containing detail items and then wrapping a parent group around the outside of those details. Let's begin by removing the existing title text box in the report, and then we can replace that by inserting a new table. I'll begin then, as I said, by inserting the detail items that I would like to see below each director's details. So for each director I would like to see the title of the films they've made, followed by the release date and the runtime minutes, and then also the Oscar wins which I'll just drag from the report data window. Having done this, I can now add a director parent group. I can do this either by right-clicking into the table, or as I prefer to do it, right-clicking in the row groups panel. If I right-click on the details item, I can choose to add a group, and this will be a parent group, so let's choose that option. I can then choose which field I'd like to group by. Eventually I'd like to see the full name of the director, but to apply the grouping for slightly better performance I'm going to go with the director ID field. This is the primary key field of the director table. I'll also include a group header at this stage, although I could also choose to include that later on. But once I've done that, if I click OK, we'll now see that I get a table with a group along with details. And if I run the report, you should see that we get, although it's not particularly useful and readable at this point, I get the ID number of the director rather than the name. You can see that the data is clearly grouped. And as I scroll down, we'll move into the different director ID groups. The main obvious change you would make to this table would be to replace the ID with the director's name, and that's pretty straightforward to do. Back in the design view, we can simply use the field selector for the director ID column and replace that with the full name field instead. That doesn't do anything to affect the way the data is grouped, it just changes what value gets displayed in that cell in the table. So if I run the report again, this time we'll see that we get the directors' names rather than just their ID numbers. So that's the details first approach. Let's have a look at how we could take things from the opposite direction and start with the group. Back in the design view, let's give ourselves a little bit more space in the report page and then insert a new table towards the top. This time what I'm going to do is include the director's full name field first. And then I'd like to convert this into a group, so rather than showing one row for each film in the dataset, I would like to show one row for each director. So with that table selected, in the Groups panel, I can right-click on the Details 1 item and then head to the Group Properties dialog box. I can add a group expression to group the rows in this table based on the Director ID field. And let's change the name of the group. Details doesn't really make sense. Let's call it Director ID Group. Having done that, if I click OK, we should see now that the details item changes, or the details icon, the 3 horizontal bars, changes to the standard parenthesis or bracket symbol. What I can now do is choose to include some detail items in this table. Again, I can do this either by right-clicking on an item in the table, or as I prefer, right-click on an item in the Groups panel. If I right-click on my Director ID group, I can now choose to add a group. Previously we chose to add a parent group, this time it will be a child group. Now I don't actually want to group anything new in the table. I've got my one and only group that I'm going to use. What I'd like to do is show the details of each current group. So if I choose Show Detail Data and then click OK, we'll see we get effectively the same sort of arrangement as we got in the previous table. If I look and compare the icons we can see on the left-hand side of each table, you can see that those are now the same. There's a slight difference in the positioning of the various fields we've put in, but if I change the group column so that it shows the full name of the director and then remove those values from the cells in the second column, I can then simply start adding in the details items, so title, release date, runtime minutes, and I can finally click and drag Oscar wins and position that in the same place. So essentially, via a slightly different route, we've reached exactly the same arrangement as we had in the first example. If I run the report just to prove that that's the case, we can see exactly the same details in the same order. So apart from a couple of minor cosmetic differences, there's no major difference in the end result using the two different approaches. Personally, I tend to follow a details first approach in most cases. But there is one small potential downside to following this approach, particularly if you forget to insert the group header or the group footer when you create the group in the first place. Let's just head back to the design view, and I'm going to remove the two tables that I've created so far by highlighting them both and then pressing the delete key. Just a very quick recap of how we created the group in the first place. If I insert a new table, I'll start with the detail rows or the detail level details, so title, release date, runtime minutes, and then Oscar wins. What I then did is chose to insert add a parent group by right-clicking the details item in the Groups panel, add group, parent group, and then choose the field that I'd like to group on, in this case, Director ID. Earlier I chose to include a header for the group, but this time I'm going to pretend to forget that and click OK. So at this stage you can see that the single row in the table, apart from the table header, comprises both the group and the detail rows. I'll just change the Director ID back to the full name so that we can read more clearly what each group is. And then if I run the report, you can see that we get the data grouped, but the problem is that I've not got any opportunity to repeat these column headers. The column headers appear at the top of the entire table, but not when I switch between different directors, so it can be tricky to read what's going on. To solve this, what I'd like to do is insert a group header in which I can show these column headers: title, release date, runtime minutes, and Oscar wins. So let's head back to the design view to see how we can do that. A common approach to insert a new row into a table is to start by selecting a single cell in it, and then right-click on the grey row selector at the left-hand side. Now if I do that, I can choose to insert a row, but the only choices I get are above or below. If I choose above, what I end up with is another details item. You should be able to see in the icons shown at the left-hand side of the table, I've got this repeating 3 horizontal bar symbol on both rows. So that means that the new row I've inserted will be repeated not once for the group, but once for each detail item in the table. If I run the report, you'll see I basically get a blank row above each film name, which isn't quite what I wanted. So let's head back to the design view and then let's just undo inserting that row. The trick to making this work is to identify the columns separated by these double dotted lines. You should just about be able to make these out if I zoom in. On the left hand side of this on this arrow, when I right click and insert a row, I get the extra details item. However, if I right click into a cell on the detail row to the right of the double dotted line, I can choose to insert a row and then I can choose outside group above. So the context of the group in this case is the detail item. If I place this outside of the detail group, it goes to the next higher level in the group, which happens to be the director ID. So you should be able to make out this time that the new row doesn't have the 3 horizontal bars, indicating it's a group header, not a detail item. I can do exactly the same thing to place a group footer, so I can right click to the right hand side of the double dotted line, insert row, outside group below, so the row remains within the group but not within the details row. If I run the report this time, we should see that at the top of each director I get a blank row for column headers, and at the bottom I get a blank row for any aggregates I might like to apply. And that pattern is repeated for each other director in the list. All I need to do now for the group headers is to move these column headings at the very top of the table into that new blank row. So let's head back to the design view and let's avoid a lot of typing. What I'm going to do to start with is select the 4 current column headers at the top of the table in this static row. Then I'm going to press Ctrl X on the keyboard to cut them, and then click into the first cell in the group header and then press Ctrl and V to paste. So having done that, I'll now see that my headers will be repeated for each individual director rather than just once at the top of the table. So you'll see these headers repeated. Another change I commonly make to the default layout of the grouped table is to place the director's name as a banner heading which spans all 4 columns rather than as its own separate column on the left hand side. In order to do that, I can head back to the design view, and what I'll need to do is insert a new row which sits within the group header. So here I can revert to right clicking on the grey row selector at the left hand side of the table. If I do that, I can choose to insert a row inside the group above. I'd like it to remain in the director group. Having done that, you should be able to make out that my parenthesis, my bracket symbol extends to include that new row. I can then highlight all 4 cells and then I can right click on those and choose to merge those cells into one single. I can then place the full name field in that new merged cell. And then what I can do then is right click and delete the first column entirely. I no longer need to see the director's name in the left hand column. So I can right click at the top of that column and choose to delete it. If I then switch back to the run the report and have a look at the running version, I can see I get my director name at the top of each group rather than sitting at the left hand side. It's also nice and simple to add in some aggregates at the bottom of each group in the footer row. So let's head back to the design view, and as we've seen in previous videos, you can simply select a field in the footer of a group just to apply a simple sum. So if I choose runtime minutes at the bottom of the runtime minutes column, it will give me a sum of runtime minutes. I can then also do the same thing for Oscar wins to add a sum of Oscar wins. If I'd also like to see an average of those, of course, I can insert a new row into the group footer. So I can right click on the grey row selector, insert a row inside the group below. I can then choose runtime minutes at the bottom of the runtime minutes column again. Then I can click onto the function that's been added. So I can click on the sum to highlight the entire thing in blue, right click, summarize by, and then choose AVG instead. Exactly the same thing for Oscar wins. I can select Oscar wins, select it by clicking on the expression that's been added, and then right click, summarize by, AVG. At this point, it's probably worthwhile spending a little time formatting the table to make it look vaguely readable. It's not particularly readable at this point. If we merge some cells in the very top row, the table header first of all, let's select all the cells in the table header, right click and merge them. We can then replace the title in that cell by saying something like, let's say, table of films by directors. We can then apply some colouring to the cells and some font colouring to make them stand out. So let's select the table header. Let's make the table header a very dark shade of blue, and then make the font colour quite light, and then let's embolden that. And then for the direct name, or the full name, let's use a slightly lighter shade of blue or purplish for that. And I'll make the font names consistent as well. So the font, I'd like to use Arial for all the titles. Then we can highlight the column headers below that, and let's use an even slightly lighter shade of blue, and then let's embolden those titles. I just want to edit the title for the runtime minutes column as well to remove the word minutes. We can then change the column width for the title column to make sure that we have enough space to read long film titles. Let's apply a format to the release date cell as well. I can do this by right-clicking and choosing to view the text box properties dialog, and then head to the number tab, and then from the date list I can choose a preferred date format. I'll go with this one, 31 Jan 2000. Of course, remember you can do that from the properties window as well. If you wanted to apply a format, you can find the number format property and write in your date format in that box there. Let's just add some quick row titles to the aggregate section as well. I'm going to call the first row total, and then below that we can say average, and then let's just add some basic formatting to these as well. Let's kind of match the same sort of formatting we used for the header section. Then likewise for the actual aggregate values themselves, let's replicate some of the formatting we've already used. And for the averages, I'd just like to make sure that we only see 2 decimal places. So I'm going to select those 2 cells. Annoyingly, when I have 2 cells selected, I can't use the number or the text box properties dialog box. So what I can do here is use the number format property in the properties panel, and let's give it a format of 0.00, just in case you can't make that out. There we go. Alright, so with those changes made, one last thing, I'd like to remove the borders from around these 2 cells here. So if I select these 2 cells, I can then use the borders tool to choose no border or none from the list. And then if I run the report again, we should see something looking a little more readable. The final thing I'd like to do for this video is apply some basic sorting to the table. So I'd like to see my film titles sorted in ascending order within each group, but I'd also like to see the directors' names sorted in alphabetical order as well. Let's head back to the design view, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, the best place to apply sorting, if you have the option, is within the query of the dataset itself. So let's right click on the dataset and choose to view its properties. Now unfortunately there's no way to do this in the query designer in Report Builder, but what you can do is add your own order by clause to the query text in the query text box. So if I zoom in so you can see what I'm about to do here, if I say order by, and then I can say order by film.title. The default sort order is ascending anyway, but you can optionally add ASC to indicate that that's exactly what you meant to do. And then if I simply click OK, and then run the report again, you should be able to see now that within each group you get the film titles sorted alphabetically. We could take the same approach to apply a sort to the director name column as well. Let's head back to the design view and then view the properties of our dataset. If I once again zoom in so you can see what I'm typing, I want to sort first of all by director name and then by film title. So I'm going to add in a reference to the director full name field by saying director.fullname. Feel free to copy and paste from a previous part of this query if you don't want to risk misspelling column names. I want to sort that in ascending order, and then I also need to comma separate the fields that I'm sorting in the order by clause. The problem with doing things in this way, unfortunately because of the way I've added a group, is that this new order by won't have any effect on the final table. We'll still see that we get Steven Spielberg listed first. And if you've watched previous videos in this series, you'll know that that's because when you assign a group in the groups panel, as we've done, it automatically applies a sort to the group using the field you've selected. So let's right click on the director ID column in the groups panel, and then choose to view the group properties for this group. If we then switch onto the sorting page, you'll see that it's got a sort by director ID, which is overriding the sort that we've placed in the Dataset's query. We could do a couple of things here. The simplest by far is just to delete this field. I can then click OK, and then if I preview the report again, I'll now see this time that I get my directors sorted alphabetically as well. Using the order by clause in a dataset query is certainly the best option for performance reasons, but you might not always have that choice. For example, if your dataset is populated by a stored procedure, for example. If we switch back to the design view and view the dataset properties again, this time I'm just going to remove the entire order by clause from the query. So all the things that I typed in earlier on, I can select all of that and then just delete it. When I click OK and run the report again, you'll see that the sorting of my table has gone back to its original sort order. We can still apply sorting to both the groups and the details using the Groups panel. So let's apply some sorting to the Details item first. If I right-click on that and choose Group Properties, as we've just deleted a sort, you can also add sorts in the Group Properties dialog box. We can choose to add, and here I'll sort by title A to Z. Click OK. Then I'll do the same thing to the Director ID group. I can right-click Director ID and choose Group Properties. On the sorting page, I can add a new sort, and this time I'd like to sort by the full name in ascending order. If I then click OK and then run the report, I'll end up with the exact same results I saw earlier. Okay, so that's it for this basic video on table groups with detail rows. Hope you found some of that useful. Join us for the next one where we'll start talking about how you can control page breaks between groups, including how to make column headers appear at the top of each page. Thanks for watching, see you next time.